The Romantic era is well known for its towering works of fiction, written almost exclusively, but not only, by men. In this talk, I want to address with you romantic fiction. For so long, the prose literary fiction of the British Romantic era was disregarded and, even when studied, not considered in the context of its own time and in the movement, the artistic movement of Romanticism. This is wrong, and in recent decades, Romantic scholars have begun to reassess some of the major works of British literary fiction that were written during the same years that Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley and Keats were active, the end of the 18th century, the 1790s, through the first decades of the 19th century, the 1800s. In addition, some of these authors are extremely well known, including, as we'll talk about today, Jane Austen and Mary Shelley. We'll talk about these figures. We'll look at some select passages from within their extensive corpuses of writing, and we'll also talk a little bit about the natural world and how, as I'm always interested, how the events of the period, the larger history, both political and global, on the greatest scale of planetary climate, actually affect and interface and influence the works and our interpretation of them. And let's begin by talking a little bit about the status of fiction in the Romantic period. Fiction was thought to be of inferior quality, less important, less developed, less artistic than poetry. Although the novel had already become nearly about 100 years old, let's not forget that Robinson Crusoe is 1719. We're going to be talking about texts that are written, we're going to talk about two novels published in 1818. Nonetheless, the novel had not yet achieved a parallel status to the artistic value and weight, the heft of poetry. During the Romantic period, the many, myriad, abundant works of novels, of prose fiction that were being published were done for commercial purposes, were considered high entertainment. Many people were reading them, but it was considered work for children, for women, for the lower classes, all ways of dismissing and diminishing the value of this quality of writing. It was considered art, it was considered entertainment, not art. The mystery, romantic stories about mysterious identities or hidden birth stories, the sentimental novels about love and emotion, the works of manners about how to behave, the virtue stories that we've already encountered. These were all ways of positioning, of portraying novels as sentimental, not serious, entertainment, not art and not serious thought, as personal and subjective rather than as social, political, and objective or intellectual. Jane Austen comes right into the middle of all of this. Jane Austen writes her works during her 6 major novels from the 1790s through her death in 1817, and in that course, although she's previously been thought to be sort of a whole generation earlier, she's writing during the era of the sensibility in Johnson mid-18th century. She does learn from and apply the Johnsonian style, that precision of language and wit, but is thoroughly engaged with political concerns and social questions of her own time. She also is among the many women writers, the many authors who, along with Frances Burney and others, who innovate what's called free indirect discourse. And while we today read only a handful of novels from this period, the extraordinary output by presses like the Minerva Press, who are producing very profitable book after book after book, together collaborate to develop this style that Austen today is very well known for. By the way, Austen was also disregarded for many years. She was widely read in her own day, but was not considered historically or critically important. It only was in the 20th century that she was reclaimed and became this beloved international figure that many people know and reread today. Free indirect discourse, for which she is well known, although, as I've said, not the sole progenitor, is this way of writing that bridges together the personal reported speech of a main character and what they are, and the indirect narrative from a narrator, and goes into the character's head. It presents the thoughts and words of a fictional character as if from that character's point of view, by writing in a specific grammatical, syntactical way that allows it to be with the character's direct speech and a narrator's indirect perspective. It is this reported inward speech and thought that you get both not in strict narrator and not in a first-person narration. It conveys a narrator's subjectivity. What it does effectively is a few things. First, it elevates characters from just being vessels or agents of activity and events, so that you're reading as a reader. You're not just identifying with what happens to a character, but what they are thinking. They are models of consciousness. They are models of thought, and therefore their development and how we read them as cognition becomes a way of developing the self, in addition to saying this story happened to them. Not just a set of events and passages, but also a set of ideas and moral quandaries. Reading them thus becomes a more intellectually fruitful endeavor. It also has significance, secondly, a parallel to on the social or political plane. The free indirect discourse as kind of a intermediate, in-between style marries, to use a Austen pun, marries together the gentry, the aristocratic higher classes, the landed class, with the readership that had been the readership and authorship of novels to the time, the middle class and upper middle classes, the professional classes from which Austen herself came, as the daughter of a parson, and many of her characters represent. And that tension between these different groups, the upper classes, people with permanent wealth, who sort of had set the terms of British culture for so long, and these lower classes who had developed this commercially successful way of writing, and how they come together in shared interest, in love, and in long-term partnerships, meaning in marriage, is both her concern, and it's the primary concern of the readership of her time. That too is reflected in the way that she writes, in this kind of voice that gets into everybody's head. And this innovation also allows the novel to become a more serious vehicle that articulates this ruling class that is now going to include both the aristocracy and the professional soldiers, clergy, law professional classes that make the empire and make the country work. And of course also the business people, the many merchants and the authors, and allows the novel to become a serious work of art, a vehicle for British society and culture, as we'll see in the sort of as one could say in the great style of the major Victorian novels. In her last novel, Jane Austen's Persuasion, written at the end of 1816, published posthumously several months after Austen's death in 1817, and it's the only text, I believe, for which we have in part, Austen's own manuscript. You can see it here on the page. The extraordinary revisions, her effortless natural style is itself, of course, the product of extraordinary labor, revision, rewriting, and striking out. It is a novel, as all of her novels are, about how to perceive the other, how to perceive the self, reading as an important social endeavor and activity on the level of observation, moral thought, and philosophy, and poetry. The terrain that had been in other fields is also here brought into the novel at its nearly centennial, or past its centennial point. Here you can see a quote: "One man's ways may be as good as another's, but we all like our own the best." That property of mediating between the self, the interaction between the self and others, judging the self. Of course, that is the work of Jane Austen's all her novels. Here is the title page of Persuasion. You could see her name is not even on it, just her other books, which were widely read, but the name of a woman author is not printed there, nor was it for the Brontes, who used all kinds of pseudonyms. This actually is drawings of Austen from her own life. The bottom one is a watercolor by her sister, where you see Jane Austen from the back. Let's look at a passage from the very end of this novel. In chapter 23, the second to last chapter of Jane Austen's final novel, Persuasion, published in this year that we're going to talk about, 1816, she writes about a conversation between the protagonist, Anne Elliot, and a confederate, a friend of Anne's love interest, whose name is Captain Wentworth. They're all officers of the Navy, naval officers, part of that professional class. And they're talking about men and women, differences between the genders, love, and literature and reading. The characters get into Anne and Captain Harville, a friend who is the interlocutor for Anne Elliot, while Captain Wentworth, her love interest, is writing a letter on the other side of the room, focuses on the constancy of love. How quickly do young people, men and women, get over their love interest when romance breaks down? The debate is about this woman. They see a friend of theirs. Who could she have forgotten over? Will she get over her breakup, her lost love, and will she ever love again? It says Captain Harville maintains that only a man will hold on to that flame, will hold on to that love forever. Men have stronger emotions. They are the more developed and stronger sex, and therefore, as he says here, we do not forget you so soon as you forget us. We cannot help ourselves. We live at home, and we are the ones who we're the ones with stronger emotions, and women are more fickle. Here is what he says. It is not man's nature. We're not allowed to be more man's nature than woman's nature, to be inconstant and forget those love. These are the words of Captain Harville. And he's rebutting Anne's assertion that women love more strongly. He says, no, we are the ones who remain constant. I believe the reverse. I believe in a true analogy between our bodily frames and our mental. Just as our bodies are stronger, so too are our minds. And that as our bodies are stronger, so are our feelings. The sentimental novel here in the voice of a man, in a novel written by a woman, saying that men have the more powerful emotions. You feelings may be strongest, Anne replies, but the same spirit of analogy will authorize me, I like that word authorize me, to assert that ours are the most tender. Man is more robust than woman, true, I grant you that, but he is not longer lived, which is why these will last longer. We will hold our feelings for much longer. You have difficulties, privations, dangers enough to struggle with. You're out there in the world toiling. You're the professionals, laboring and toiling, exposed to every risk and hardship. She's talking to someone who's been at sea for long, and we'll see that a little bit. He's a little out of touch, as a lot of Austen characters are, as opposed to the author, who is very much aware of what's happening in the world, but her characters are often out of touch and not aware of the changes that have been at work during the Romantic era. Your home, country, friends, all quitted, neither time nor health nor life to be called your own. It would be too hard indeed if women's were feelings. You have other issues. Yes, your feelings might be very strong, but you're distracted. You have to deal with income, with empire, with control, with combating nature. Captain Harville comes back. He's not convinced. It says, we shall never agree upon this. I think we simply have different views. It's unbridgeable. On the other side of the room, they stop talking for a second because they hear a sound, and they notice that Captain Wentworth may be listening, but he's been writing all along Anne's own love interest, Captain Wentworth, but his pen had only fallen. The pen has come out of his hand for just a minute. Have you finished your letter? No, I'll be done in a minute. They go back to their conversation now. The pen will become important in just 1 minute. Miss Elliot, as I was saying, we shall never agree upon this point. It is an intractable point. We cannot come to some sort of consensus. No man and woman would probably. We're too different. But let me observe that all the histories, and what's his proof for all this? Books. I have read a lot, and I can tell you that men have stronger feelings than women. Women are more fickle and capricious. All the histories, all the novels, all the romances, all the stories, prose and verse, are against you, Anne. And I could bring you 50 quotations in a moment to support on my side of the argument. I do not think I ever opened a book in my life which had not something to say upon woman's inconstancy. That is the constant. That's the permanent theme. That's the fixed theme, the fixed idea of literature, the romances of the Middle Ages and so on, the court romances of women who go from one love to another love. That is what they all talk about. Songs and proverbs, poetry and verse. poetry and prose, they all talk of woman's fickleness, but perhaps you will say these were all written by men. So Austen gets in the last point, and here's where the answer is. And the answer, you can see it here both on the slide and here below. Anne Elliot replies, perhaps I shall. Perhaps I will say that they were all written by men, and that's why they're all biased. Yes, yes, if you please. No reference to examples in books. You can't use books to prove your point. This is, of course, ironic. It's in a book. It's in a novel. At the end of a vaunted career writing novels, men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. They've had so much more to say. They've had so much more opportunity to say it. Education has been theirs in so much higher a degree. The pen has been in their hands. That's the pen of Wentworth that fell out of his hand, that she has him writing. Austen has him write, or the narrator has Wentworth writing that note, falls out of his hand, and it's during his writing of that note that will bring the actual novel to a climax. She says, of course, the pen is really in Austen's hand. Austen is the one who's writing this here is Austen's own penmanship. The pen is now in this woman's hand, at least. But how should we prove anything? What can you prove from a novel? It's all about how you read this. It is all about the practice of reading and the ability to understand words on the page, models of mind, models of consciousness of people, different people out there in the world. And these characters are often led astray by their own reading, by reading of sentimental novels, by reading more obsolete novels. None of them are reading a text quite like this. In many of these texts, their reading actually works from the Minerva Press. Some of those cheap and diminished, denigrated novels. But this kind of work that portrays society as a macrocosm of what is happening here in the personal sphere of these different people from different classes, working things out, trying to interpret their own reading experiences and their place in the world of a changing culture and changing economy. All that is here in the novel, which of course is what is going to elevate this form in the first place. What can you prove from anything? What can you prove from books? Well, we never shall. We can never expect to prove anything upon such a point. It is a difference of opinion. And the novel, of course, is the space for working out those differences of opinion. Let's turn now to Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley is also, she's considered during her life sort of a junior partner to her much more, was not famous, but much more radical, much more dominant boyfriend, later husband, partner, Percy Bysshe Shelley, a true revolutionary. She has, at a very young age, as a teenager, 15, 16 years old, gone off to live with him. Once he leaves England, she follows him. They are in Geneva, on the bank, not in the city, but on the shores of Lake Geneva, in the summer of 1816, during this crucial period, this crucial year, when there is the following a major volcanic eruption on the other side of the world in Indonesia, something they know nothing about. One of the largest, Mount Tambora, one of the largest eruptions in civilized geological history, meaning during not prehistory, but in the last several thousand years, an enormous eruption that spreads ash throughout the earth, all around the earth, and in England leads to what is known as 1816, 1 year later, the year without a summer, a year in which it snowed in the middle of the summer, rains throughout the entire year, crops failed. It actually was a geological disaster of climate change. It passed, as these things as does happen with volcanic eruptions, not with man-made eruptions. And in that course, the four friends famously retired to Villa Diodati, a villa that Byron had rented, their most rich and also extremely eccentric and flamboyant and talented, brilliant friend, Lord Byron, and brings several of their friends. Mary Shelley is there. They engage in, as Mary Shelley writes in the preface to her 1831 version of Frankenstein, a storytelling competition to tell ghost stories, scary stories during this appalling and frightening summer. Mary Shelley cannot write to begin with. She has not someone who has written that much. She is the daughter of very well-known and influential and radical intellectual parents. her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, who died giving birth to Mary Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft is the author of On the Rights of Woman, On the Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a parallel to On the Rights of Man, written by Thomas Paine. Her father, William Godwin, is also a very famous philosopher. She writes that everyone expected me to write something and I never could. So this story, what I want you to read is the preface to this text. If you want to read the whole novel, fabulous. The story is probably known to you, even if you've never actually picked up the book. It is the story, of course, of it is a first-person narration of the medical student Victor Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein is the doctor creating this monster, artificial life. It has to do with in this text, how is it a comment on the romantic themes about what is very powerful emotions. It also is about what creates life. It is reflecting also on science today, science sort of gone haywire, the ability to spark life, what actually is life. There were all these ideas about spontaneous generation. An ancestor of Charles Darwin, Erasmus Darwin, held beliefs about spontaneous generation if electricity could be inserted into bacteria, into microbes. What could create life? What could create culture? What could create ideas? And what creates writing? That is the heart of that is behind this preface, this extraordinary document that is later addition to the original novel. She writes, how could so young a girl, a teenager at the time, in that same summer of 1816, the same year in which Persuasion was written, she, a younger woman, Mary Shelley, writes Frankenstein after being pressured into participating into literally a competition about text, competition about writing, and these great poets have story after story. She cannot come up with what to tell, and what she creates is, as she says, hideous. It was denigrated. It was considered appalling, grotesque. And how could a young woman, of all people, come up with it? This hideous an idea. It is about what we create being somehow disgusting, appalling, and hideous to us. Also, that has to do with parentage, literary creation, cultural creation, and the relationship, of course, between men and women. Of course, it is, and likewise, it is a man, Victor Frankenstein, who tries to supplant the maternal role by becoming the sole parent, the only parent to his monster. Trying to do without woman, trying to do without in an unnatural way. Her husband, as Mary Shelley writes, was anxious that I should prove myself worthy of my parentage and worthy, of course, of being a consort to the great Percy Bysshe Shelley by writing something. And Byron had suggested it. Have you thought of a story? And each day she said she could not, until it came to her in a dream. What came to her? This vision. And it is a vision in which I guess many people have compared Dr. Frankenstein to the extraordinary, talented, and unbounded man of Percy Bysshe Shelley. She sees the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together, something which is more grotesque and appalling and more powerful. It is a sublime creation this is a text that warns about trespassing upon the sublime, but also the power of it. And it says, and she writes, I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. There is a criticism of the romantic impulse, in brief, in the backstory to the creation of this most paradigmatic romantic novel, Frankenstein, about the unhallowed arts, about using the powers of discovery and following them to their logical end, about emotion, about discovery, about enlightenment, and about authorship and creativity as the means of finding a more elevated and sometimes extremely destructive mode of life.